Right, welcome again to Financial Management, and today we're going to be briefly discussing what we can see there on the notes. So these notes are available for you there in the groups. If you didn't access them, just come to my inbox and I can send these notes through to you. So you'll realize that these first topics that we are doing in particular seem to carry a lot of theory. They seem to carry quite a lot of reading, which is not much. And of course, remember, I say to you, these you'll only need to read at least 3 times. I think once you go through these notes 3 times, you can as well put them away. You will hardly forget what's written here. So like I was saying, you don't really get examination questions that ask you to define these things that are in these notes, but you will be in a situation where you will be required to analyze maybe new assessment of your situation, of a situation or a scenario. You'll be required to display an understanding of these concepts that are being spoken about in these notes. So hence, they are very important, so important that you need to just read them 3 times, then they'll be stuck at the back of your head. So some of these things, it's second year stuff, and please remember that it's also a prerequisite, right? Part of your study material is from second level. So which means the examiners are free to examine you quite on anything between second level and third level. So of which most of what you'll be getting here basically is just your application of this knowledge here, how you are able to put that through in a scenario, how you can, make it come alive, bring it out in a real situation. So today it's a risk and the business environment. So with risk in particular, if you have done this module before, I'm sure you will appreciate that most of the theory questions that you get have got to do with your assessment of a certain risk or an assessment of risks that are given in a scenario, right? How you can pull that out. So this is part of your training, because this is financial management. So it's the management part there of this module, right? Then after we are done with this, I think soon after we finish this, the next notes are going to be on capital structure, and stuff on capital structure is also going to start a little bit on theory. But as we get to the middle of that topic, capital structure, we start introducing the calculations. In particular, the one that we'll be doing is for the weighted average cost of capital. That's the main part which we are going to use also through, which is a tool that we're going to use throughout the course of this module, because of how important it is. All right, so what is risk in any case? So when a situation is asking you to talk about risk or to describe certain risks in a scenario, then you need to first of all understand what a risk is, right? So what is a risk? So a risk can be described as a potential to have a possible deviation from a planned or desirable outcome. So at the beginning of every module, or at the beginning of every semester, we all have plans about how we want the semester to go. But as someone was saying earlier today, you know where the danger is. That particular thing is the risk that she was referring to there. There's a risk that things might not go the way you want them to go. Some of the risks that, if we're to describe some of the risks that we face as students, we start looking at things like these power cuts that are coming and what have you. So they can be personal risks, and then they can be risks that emanate from the bigger environment, from the external environment, as it were. So those can be broken down. I think you will be able to see that on these notes there. So which means in any situation, you can basically draw up an analysis. So this is more of management now than financial management. So at the end of the day, if you're going to be sitting in these meetings, if you're going to be writing an exam, you don't just have to display, your arithmetic quickness or your arithmetic acumen. You also need to be able to be real, right? You need to be able to be real and to talk words that are understandable, to be able to decipher situations, basically. So this is the part that we are learning in the first few topics. So this is going to come in handy pretty much in every other topic that we're going to do. Like in capital structure, we are also going to be looking at risk. You see, risk is everywhere. All right, so whenever there is a possibility that the outcome is not going to be desirable, or the outcome is going to be different, right? When there's a risk, when there's a possibility that we might deviate from that plan, then we refer to that as risk, right? And you will realize that at the end of the day, if you're going to be engaging in business, there's always going to be the aspect of risk. The risk is always going to be there, right? And then this risk must, however, be managed in terms of sound risk management and governance principles. So this, again, I think it was covered in MEC 2602. So there's a bit of it on the notes there, so it's going to be quite helpful. So you will unlikely get a question specific on that, but like I said, you're going to be required to do an application of this. Right, so these are some of the categories there of risks that an entity can be exposed to. So reputational. So I saw another question last year for, I think it was MAC for something, one of these honors modules, where they were talking about the risk that is posed by social media, right? If you're going to have your company on social media, what sort of risks are you going to be facing there? And then part of the risks, part of the solution should have been reputational risks there. I always like to give an example. I don't know if you guys remember what happened with the clicks issue not so long ago. I think it's last year, if not last year, but one, where they made a comment regarding kinky hairstyles or some kinky hair. And then everyone was up in arms and they wanted to cancel clicks as a result of that. So that's an example of how social media can pose a reputational risk. So things travel quite fast on social media, and your reputation can really be destroyed very quickly on social media. But in any case, here we're looking at some of the, so in case we could be dealing with a company that's online based, or that's very big on social media, then if you're going to be considering, if they ask you about some of the risks that the company might face, then consider reputational risks, because this is very big, especially nowadays, given what happens on Twitter, on Facebook, etc. And then, of course, economic risks. We have financial risks, again, environmental, political. So when you talk of economic, this one we should know quite a lot of, given what's happening. And then the financial part, in any case, I'm sure if you throw a stone now, you're going to hit someone who's facing financial challenges, so they know what that risk entails, right? So, but for learning purposes, this one is the risk that an entity may not be able to meet its financial obligations. So financial obligations, this, as we're going to realize in the next topic, comes in big if you're going to be in debt, right? If you're going to be debt financed as an organization, then you are increasing the financial risk there. So remember, I think we're doing this in, I can't remember now if it was in this class where we're distinguishing between equity financing and debt financing. And we're saying that, okay, we didn't say, but we will say in our next session that equity financing does not, it's not mandatory for you to be paying dividends to equity shareholders. But when it comes to debt, you have a contractual obligation for you to be paying interest and for you to repay the capital amount. So once you have debt, it means that you have exposed yourself to that financial risk that maybe you might not be able to meet those financial obligations. What if COVID-19 happens again and you're in a situation where you really don't have cash flow, you really don't have the liquidity to be paying off these interests? So hence you saw some people's houses were repossessed, some taxis were taken off the road. That's the financial risk there, because they were not able to meet the financial obligations there. All right, and then of course the environmental. This, I think, has been growing a little bit here in this part of the world. if you look at the floods now, look at what's been happening with the floods. So this is the risk that is associated with the environment and the nature, such as climate change and natural disasters. So next time you take insurance, maybe think about taking an insurance that covers this environmental risk. You know, we hardly think about these things up until there's a flood. You wake up in the morning and your company vehicles are well underwater. So this is the risk there. And then the political risk, of course, we are very much aware of that here. We are very much aware of that. So there's a march that is planned. I don't know if you guys are aware of that. Sometime in March, the EFF is planning a march. So how is that going to affect your business? Right? How is that going to affect your business? So the other guys on the other side are advocating that there shouldn't be a march because it's going to disrupt business operations. So I'm sure you are aware of the fact that we are already gray listed now. Right? It was actually my first time hearing of that, being gray listed. I think the last time I heard this listed, it was when we were going to junk status some years back. But now we are gray listed, and that's of course for political reasons. If you go behind and try and inquire what's going on there, if you dig in deep, but we have economic reasons again for that, right? But in any case, that's a political risk there. That's a political risk, which is the risk which is associated with political instability. Whatever decisions they make out there, they basically have a trickle effect on our businesses. And then the regulatory risk, again, regulations are going to change. And mostly the driving force again to these changes could be political, right? But sometimes these regulations can change to align with certain international standards, right? So when you don't adhere to those regulations, then your entity might be in trouble, right? Some of these regulations might even require for you to alter some of your business operations. You see, there could be some. If you take, for example, there were not so long ago where it was mandatory for people to wear masks, and there was, this whole social distancing thing. So imagine if you were owning a restaurant during that time, or you were owning, say, a bus company, or something like that. It basically means that there's some restrictions now that are affecting your business directly. People were selling cigarettes, and all of a sudden cigarettes are outlawed. So that's the regulatory risk there. And then which is also linked, of course, to compliance risks, because it's unlikely that some of these here require for you to comply, right? And if you don't comply with those, you might end up being subject to some of these penalties, you see. And then this is also linked again to legal risk. But then with legal risk, you're looking at possible litigations against the business. So these can emanate from any one of those there, right? They can basically emanate from any one of those there, but basically also the business relationship with your stakeholders. All right, and then the last one here that we have on the list is the exchange rate risk. This again, if you are particularly exporting and importing, so some of the organizations, the national organizations that we're going to be dealing with here in this module are organizations that import or export. So once you see an exchange rate given in a scenario, and then think about the exchange rate risk, which is the risk that either the rand is going to depreciate, which might not be favorable to you, or it might appreciate in circumstances where it's not favorable for you. All right, I think we'll also look at that a little bit, maybe towards the end of the module. I think we have a whole learning unit on that. All right, then in addition to those, we have product risk, commodity price risk, operational risk, and strategic risk. So you can go through those there. All right, then now that we have identified the risk, how do you manage that risk? How do you then manage that risk? So which is very essential and practical, right? Especially if you run an organization of your own, once you identify risk, then you need to manage that risk, be in a position where you are able to maneuver in that risk. All right, so risk management can, now I'm reading on the last paragraph there, on the last sentence. Risk management can therefore also be described as a cyclical process, which is an ongoing and can be described in terms of the following steps. Identify the risk associated with the strategy, internal and external environment, understand and assess the risk in terms of the likelihood. So these you don't really have to cram, you just need to go through, right? Like I said, you never get a question that's going to be asking you on these steps, unless maybe if it's second level. Develop an appropriate risk response strategy and response for each key risk. Implement the risk strategy and risk response, monitor and report the outcomes, review and evaluate the risk management process. All right, that's fine. Now, what is risk appetite and risk tolerance? So this is for those now who are doing pure finance or some finance lovers. All right, so these are the categories now that we have here, right? In terms of distinguishing between an entity's attitude towards risk. So you can either be risk averse, risk neutral, or risk seeking. So it would be nice for you. So why we actually give these notes again? It's nice for you in an exam or in an assignment, even better in a conversation at work, for you to throw in these words, right? To show that you have studied financial management, you have studied finance, right? Use words like risk averse, risk neutral, and risk seeking, right? You know, every vocation basically has the terminology that they use, right? If you study auditing, you will realize that there are certain words, certain terms that are used by auditors. If you go say to doctors, there are certain words for drugs, right? And medicine that they specifically use. So even here, if you are studying finance, there are certain words that we use here, right? So which means you need to make sure that you use in those words to impress the markers. All right, so risk averse basically describes an attitude towards risk that seeks to avoid risk, right? So we refer to such an individual or such an entity or such an attitude as risk averse attitude, right? You are being risk averse every time you want to avoid risk. And then risk neutral, an attitude towards risk that is balanced. So in other words, it's moderate, right? It's moderate. So which is quite prudent in any case. And then risk seeking are those that actually go around looking for risk, that have a high appetite or a huge appetite for risk. All right, so the risk appetite of an entity, of course, is going to depend on two factors: your risk capacity. So how much risk can you take, right? Are you able to shoulder a risk, right? It's like in a war, right? You know, warfare, engaging in warfare is risk in itself. But you find yourself that if you look at the situation between Russia and Ukraine, take Ukraine, for instance, if you are facing a huge giant like Russia in warfare, you can't afford to engage, to be fighting in many fronts. In other words, to engage in extra warfare with any other country. So that means your risk capacity is low under those circumstances. You can't take risk. So as an organization, perhaps you could be facing a lot of competition. You don't have a huge risk capacity. If you look at what's happening now, the economy is close to sinking, right? It's on the brink of collapse. So most of the entities in this economy have a risk capacity that is low now. And then, of course, the other determining factor there is the risk culture, right? What is your culture in the organization with regards to risk, right? What is your attitudes and practices towards risk in the entity? So, of course, there are some entities that are going to encourage risk taking, right? But why would that be why would that be the case? That's normally the case because you realize that in normally where there is a higher risk, there is likely going to be a bigger return there. So under those circumstances, then you find that the culture within an organization can be such that it's encouraging a risk-seeking attitude. All right, so there are basically 3 key activities in the risk management process there. So it's risk identification, which is basically identifying that risk, right? It must be identified first. And then from there, you do an assessment, right? That's the second step on the process. And then the third step, you do a risk response. So some of these questions could be asking you, particularly, how would you respond to a situation, maybe a certain situation that's described in the scenario. So which is risky. So this is what you're going to be looking at there. Maybe risk response, risk mitigation, etc. All right, so let's see now, let's jump to risk identification. So this is very important. This particular part is very important. So once you know at least 2 or 3 things that are here, then you can basically answer any question that's related to risk identification. So there are actually some what you call these things now, I forget the name, but it's basically some techniques, right, that you can use to identify risks. So the most common ones are the first 3 there. The most common ones are the first 3 there. And I did see the second one in particular in one exam question, but we're just gonna discuss them in passing there so I can give you time to read through. All right, so risk identification, which is very important, by the way, both in a practical sense and in a theoretical sense. So the potential sources of information and resultant warning signs or red flags during risk identification process include, so this is what you look at now. So when you get a question now that's asking you to identify, and these are very common, by the way, they ask you to identify certain risks that company ABC could face, right? And then I think the one that I love the most is the first one, because particularly if it's a question that's carrying quite a lot of marks, there's a lot of meat there on the first one. There's a lot of meat there. So which is the political, so you can just think of anything that could go wrong, right? When we talk of risk, we are saying, okay, what could go wrong politically? And particularly, how is that going to affect the state organization or the organization in question? So hence we are dealing with political factors there. Then in terms of the economy, here, remember, when we talk of the economy, you are basically going to be dealing with stuff like the GDP, you're going to be looking at the interest rates, you're going to be looking at the inflation, particularly those. So how are those going to affect your organization? Socially, here you're going to be looking at basically what the society is on about. So sometimes socially you can be looking at the conflict. Sometimes these conflicts could be on, tribal lines, they could be on racial lines. So all these can be a cause for social unrest, you see. So how does that affect your organization, you see? Sometimes you find that there are certain organizations perhaps that are known to be for whites, some that are known to be for blacks, some are for certain tribes, so that's generally going to affect, your organization. You can't go, for instance, in an environment that's hostile to a certain tribe, and you go there with an organization that has a name, of the other tribe. You can't do that as an organization. So hence you need to assess there to identify that risk there, you see. Technological, think of Nokia, think of BlackBerry. Where are those phones today? We don't hear of those phones. Legal, we already spoke about this again. We said legal, we are dealing with litigations here. You know, there could be a risk that you can be in and out of the courts, right? And then ecological, we are looking at the environment. We also spoke about this. And then global, we are also dealing with global issues, right? So just to clarify there on something that is global, if you look at COVID-19, say it was 2019, right? Because our lockdowns only started being implemented here in 2020, if I remember well. So if it was 2019 and you're asked to identify certain risks, then part of the global risk there could have been COVID-19, because that's what's affecting people out there, and there's a likelihood that it might end up coming here, you see. So we've got diseases like Ebola, you know, foot and mouth, anthrax, etc. So all those there are global issues, and those can really affect your organizations, right? And then also ethical factors. So ethical factors, think of the state capture here. Think of the state capture. So there are some businesses now that, you know, it's not, okay, let me not even talk of businesses. Let's talk about relationships that were not encouraged, right? Or that were looked upon in a certain way as a result of some ethical consideration. So once, let's say, a business is has been, let's say, gray listed, let's use that word again. Once a business or an individual has been gray listed or blacklisted, sometimes it becomes a little bit tricky for you to be doing business with that kind of person. So if you look at like companies like KPMG, you know, they had some bad publicity, you see, they had some bad publicity. Some companies, also some accounting companies there in the United States, ended up closing down as a result of this thing here, ethics, right? Bearing in mind what I spoke about earlier before the recording about that billionaire that lost 3 billion. So such are the circumstances again that can cause the share value of a company to go down, you see. So a company like Clicks, after now you are engaged in such a scandal, and then, you know, your reputation goes down, it follows that your share price might even go down, it might dip. All right. So that's how important that is there. So other than that, you can do a SWOT analysis. So a SWOT analysis, you are looking at the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats there. So with a SWOT analysis now, you are dealing with, so risks actually come in two ways. There are those that are specific to the entity, which are internal, right? These are the ones that we can control within the entity that we have power over. So these are going to be identified there as under strengths and weaknesses. So in particular, you're going to be looking at weaknesses there if you're going to be looking at the risk, right? And then, of course, from an external environment, you're going to be looking at threats that could arise, right? But again, it's good for you to look at the strengths, again, the strengths of an organization, right? I'm sure you are aware that sometimes your biggest strength is also your weakness, or could also be your weakness, right? So, but this is not something that you can talk about in an exam. But once you get stranded again in an exam, think about these things that I'm talking about. Sometimes an organization's strength could be its weakness. For example, if you are very good with training employees, you know, that's a strength within the organization. But the danger there is you might be in a situation where you are training those people and they leave. You see, people are leaving the country now, so you could be training. I think I saw the one time I was reading about how, you know, professionals are leaving the country in their numbers. So these professionals are being trained here, but at the end of the day, they leave. All right, and then again, you've got Potter's forces model. So if you are doing MAC 3761, I think this is there in your study guides, right? I haven't seen the one for 3702, but it's worth looking at during your spare time. Right, and then you can check out the rest of these, you just read through. So I just mentioned the ones that I think are important there, but generally all those are important. Risk evaluation. So here there is inherent risk and then residual risk there. All right. Just to describe it, inherent risk involves the assessment of risk before the application of any risk response. So risk response can include the introduction of internal controls, the transfer of risk, or the management of risks. So before we respond to the risk, it's referred to as inherent risk. Then after we have responded, then we have residual risk, which involves the assessment of risk after taking into account the application of any controls, transfer and management responses to reduce that risk. All right, that's residual risk here. So in other words, that's the risk that that remains there. All right, so these are some of the responses that we can engage in. All right, so number one, risk avoidance. This, of course, you can do, especially if you are risk averse. Then you can try by all means to avoid that risk. Right, there's an example that's given there. Right, we spoke, I think, about foreign currency risk there. So one way in which you can avoid that risk is to, entering into, we call these forward contracts, right? Entering into those forward contracts, but we are going to do those much later. Right? But there are generally ways in which you can avoid different kinds of risks, all right? But this is big, particularly if you are doing pure finance. Right, then risk transfer, you are looking at getting an insurance policy. So in other words, you are transferring your risk to a third party or to the next individual. Risk acceptance, you're like, okay, well, the risk is there. So this response is where the expected return compensates for the expected risk. So under those circumstances, you're like, okay, well, we are willing to go with this one. All right, and then risk mitigation. So to mitigate something is to reduce it. All right. So risk mitigation also accepts the risk, but every attempt is made to minimize its impact. Right. So that again is in two aspects, which is risk control and risk financing. So you can also go through that there. And then the last one is risk diversification. All right. So an example of this is investing in a variety of industries as opposed to a single industry. Right. That will be a very good example there. So I think what's left for you now is to, like I said, go through these notes 3 times, and then you're going to be good to answer. Most of the theory questions are based on this here, most of the theory questions. If it's not going to be ratio analysis, then it's going to be something on identify the risks or how best can these risks be mitigated. All right. So this is important again to go through, so that particularly when you're going to be answering those questions, where you can use the terminology that is familiar within the module. So that's going to be very helpful there.